The other year, looking through a newspaper of sound principles, but whose staff will persist in casting anchors and going to sea on a ship, I came across an article upon the season's yachting, and behold, it was a good article, to a man who had but little to do with pleasure sailing, though all sailing is a pleasure, and certainly nothing whatever with racing in open waters. The writer's strictures upon the handicapping of yachts were just intelligible, and no more, and I do not pretend to any interest in the enumeration of the great races of that year. As to the 52-foot linear ratters praised so much by the writer, I am warmed up by his approval of their performances, but as far as any clear conception goes, the descriptive phrase, so precise to the comprehension of a yachtsman, evokes no definite image in my mind. The writer praises that class of pleasure vessels, and I am willing to endorse his words, as any man who loves every craft afloat would be ready to do. I am disposed to admire and respect the 52-foot liner ratters on the word of a man who regrets in such a sympathetic and understanding spirit the threatened decay of yachting seamanship. Of course, yacht racing is an organized pastime, a function of social idleness, ministering to the vanity of certain wealthy inhabitants of these isles nearly as much as to their inborn love of the sea. But the writer of the article in question goes on to point out, with insight and justice, that for a great number of people, 20,000, I think he says, it is a means of livelihood, that it is, in his own words, an industry. Now, the moral side of an industry, productive or unproductive, the redeeming and ideal aspect of this breadwinning is the attainment and preservation of the highest possible skill on the part of the craftsman. Such skill, the skill of technique, is more than honesty, it is something wider, embracing honesty and grace and rule in an elevated and clear sentiment, not altogether utilitarian, which may be called the honor of labor. It is made up of accumulated tradition, kept alive by individual pride, rendered exact by professional opinion, and like the higher arts, it is spurred on and sustained by discriminating praise. This is why the attainment of proficiency, the pushing of your skill with attention to the most delicate shades of excellence, is a matter of vital concern. Efficiency of a practically flawless kind may be reached naturally in the struggle for bread, but there is something beyond a higher point, a subtle and unmistakable touch of love and pride beyond mere skill, almost an inspiration which gives to all work that finish which is almost art, which is art. As men of scrupulous honor set up a high standard of public conscience above the dead level of an honest community, so men of that skill which passes into art by ceaseless striving raise the dead level of correct practice in the crafts of land and sea. The conditions fostering the growth of that supreme, alive excellence, as well in work as in play, ought to be preserved with a most careful regard, lest the industry or the game should perish of an insidious and inward decay. Therefore, I have read with profound regret in that article upon the yachting season of a certain year that the seamanship on board racing yachts is not now what it used to be only a few, very few years ago. For that was the gist of that article, written evidently by a man who not only knows but understands a thing, let me remark, in passing, much rarer than one would expect, because the sort of understanding I mean is inspired by love, and love, though in a sense it may be admitted to be stronger than death, is by no means so universal and so sure. In fact, love is rare, the love of men, of things, of ideas, the love of perfected skill. For love is the enemy of haste. It takes count of passing days, of men who pass away, of a fine art matured slowly in the course of years and doomed in a short time to pass away too, and be no more. Love and regret go hand in hand in this world of changes swifter than the shifting of the clouds reflected in the mirror of the sea. To penalize a yacht in proportion to the fineness of her performances is unfair to the craft and to her men. It is unfair to the perfection in her form and to the skill of her servants, for we men are in fact the servants of our creations. We remain in everlasting bondage to the productions of our brain and to the work of our hands. A man is born to serve his time on this earth, and there is something fine in the service of being on other grounds than that of utility. The bondage of art is very exacting, and as the writer of the article which started this train of thought says, with lovable warmth, the sailing of yachts is a fine art. His contention is that racing, without time allowances for anything else but tonnage, that is, for size, has fostered the fine art of sailing to the pitch of perfection. Every sort of demand is made upon the master of a sailing yacht, and to be penalized in proportion to your success may be of advantage to the sport itself, but it has an obviously deteriorating effect upon the seamanship. The fine art is being lost. The sailing and racing of yachts has developed a class of fore and aft sailors, men born and bred to the sea, fishing in winter and yachting in summer, men to whom the handling of that particular rig represents no mystery. It is their striving for victory that has elevated the sailing of pleasure craft to the dignity of a fine art in that special sense. As I have said, I know nothing of racing, and but little of fore and aft rig, but the advantages of such a rig are obvious, especially for purposes of pleasure, whether in cruising or racing. It requires less effort in handling. The trimming of the sail planes to the wind can be done with speed and accuracy. The unbroken spread of the sail area is of infinite advantage, and the greatest possible amount of canvas can be displayed upon the least possible quantity of spars. Lightness and concentrated power are the great qualities of fore and aft rig. A fleet of fore and afters at anchor has its own slender graciousness. The setting of their sails resembles more than anything else the unfolding of a bird's wings. The facility of their evolutions is a pleasure to the eye. They are birds of the sea, whose swimming is like flying, and resembles more a natural function than the handling of man-invented appliances. The fore and aft rig in its simplicity and the beauty of its aspect under every angle of vision is, I believe, unapproachable. A schooner, yawl, or cutter in charge of a capable man seems to handle herself as if endowed with the power of reasoning and the gift of swift execution. One laughs with sheer pleasure at a smart piece of maneuvering as at a manifestation of a living creature's quick wit and graceful precision. Of those three varieties of fore and aft rigged, the cutter, the racing rig par excellence, is of an appearance the most imposing, from the fact that practically all her canvas is in one piece. The enormous mainsail of a cutter, as she draws slowly past a point of land or the end of a jetty under your admiring gaze, invests her with an air of lofty and silent majesty. At anchor a schooner looks better, she has an aspect of greater efficiency and a better balance to the eye, with her two masts distributed over the hull, with a swaggering rake aft. The yawl rig one comes in time to love. It is, I should think, the easiest of all to manage. For racing, a cutter; for a long pleasure voyage, a schooner; for cruising in home waters, the yawl; and the handling of them all is indeed a fine art. It requires not only the knowledge of the general principles of sailing, but a particular acquaintance with the character of the craft. All vessels are handled in the same way as far as theory goes, just as you may deal with all men on broad and rigid principles. But if you want that success in life which comes from the affection and confidence of your fellows, then with no two men, however similar they may appear in their nature, will you deal in the same way. There may be a rule of conduct, there is no rule of human fellowship. To deal with men is as fine an art as it is to deal with ships. Both men and ships live in an unstable element, are subject to subtle and powerful influences, and want to have their merits understood rather than their faults found out. It is not what your ship will not do that you want to know, to get on terms of successful partnership with her. It is rather that you ought to have a precise knowledge of what she will do for you when called upon to put forth what is in her by a sympathetic touch. At first sight, the difference does not seem great in either line of dealing with the difficult problem of limitations, but the difference is great. The difference lies in the spirit in which the problem is approached. After all, the art of handling ships is finer perhaps than the art of handling men, and like all fine arts, it must be based upon a broad, solid sincerity, which, like a law of nature, rules an infinity of different phenomena. Your endeavor must be single-minded. You would talk differently to a coal heaver and to a professor. But is this duplicity? I deny it. The truth consists in the genuineness of the feeling, in the genuine recognition of the two men, so similar and so different, as your two partners in the hazard of life. Obviously, a humbug, thinking only of winning his little race, would stand a chance of profiting by his artifices. Men, professors, or coal heavers are easily deceived. They even have an extraordinary knack of lending themselves to deception, a sort of curious and inexplicable propensity to allow themselves to be led by the nose with their eyes open. But a ship is a creature which we have brought into the world, as it were, on purpose to keep us up to the mark. In her handling, a ship will not put up with a mere pretender, as for instance the public will do with Mr. X, the popular statesman, Mr. Y, the popular scientist, or Mr. Z, the popular what shall we say. anything from a teacher of high morality to a bagman who have won their little race. But I would like, though not accustomed to betting, to wager a large sum that not one of the few first-rate skippers of racing yachts has ever been a humbug. It would have been too difficult. The difficulty arises from the fact that one does not deal with ships in a mob, but with a ship as an individual. So we may have to do with men, but in each of us there lurks some practical particle of the mob spirit, of the mob temperament. No matter how earnestly we strive against each other, we remain brothers on the lowest side of our intellect and in the instability of our feelings. With ships it is not so. Much as they are to us, they are nothing to each other. Those sensitive creatures have no ears for our blandishments. It takes something more than words to cajole them to do our will, to cover us with glory. Luckily, too, or else there would have been more shoddy reputations for first-rate seamanship. Ships have no ears, I repeat, though indeed I think I have known ships who really seem to have eyes. Or else I cannot understand on what ground a certain 1,000-ton bark of my acquaintance on one particular occasion refused to answer her helm, thereby saving a frightful smash to 2 ships and to a very good man's reputation. I knew her intimately for 2 years, and in no other instant, either before or since, have I known her to do that thing. The man she had served so well, guessing perhaps at the depths of his affection for her, I have known much longer, and in bare justice to him, I must say that this confidence-shattering experience, though so fortunate, only augmented his trust in her. Yes, our ships have no ears, and thus they cannot be deceived. I would illustrate my idea of fidelity as between man and ship, between the master and his art, by a statement which, though it might appear shockingly sophisticated, is really very simple. I would say that a racing yacht skipper, who thought of nothing else but the glory of winning the race, would never attain to any eminence of reputation. The genuine masters of their craft, I say this confidently from my experience of ships, have thought of nothing but of doing their very best by the vessel under their charge. To forget oneself, to surrender all personal feeling in the service of that fine art, is the only way for a seaman to the faithful discharge of his trust. Such is the service of a fine art, and of all ships that sail the sea. And therein I think I can lay my finger upon the difference between the seamen of yesterday, who are still with us, and the seamen of tomorrow, already entered upon the possession of their inheritance. History repeats itself, but the special call of an art which has passed away is never reproduced. It is as utterly gone out of the world as the song of a destroyed wild bird. Nothing will awaken the same response of pleasurable emotion or conscientious endeavor, and the sailing of any vessel afloat is an art whose fine form seems already receding from us on its way to the overshadowed valley of oblivion. The taking of a modern steamship about the world, though one would not minimize its responsibilities, has not the same quality of intimacy with nature, which after all is an indispensable condition to the building up of an art. It is less personal and a more exact calling, less arduous but also less gratifying in the lack of close communion between the artist and the medium of his art. It is, in short, less a matter of love. Its effects are measured exactly in time and space, as no effect of an art can be. It is an occupation which a man not desperately subject to seasickness can be imagined to follow with content, without enthusiasm, with industry, without affection. Punctuality is its watchword. The incertitude which attends closely every artistic endeavor is absent from its regulated enterprise. It has no great moments of self-confidence, or moments not less great of doubt and heart-searching. It is an industry which, like other industries, has its romance, its honor, and its rewards, its bitter anxieties and its hours of ease, but such seagoing has not the artistic quality of a single-handed struggle with something much greater than yourself. It is not the laborious, absorbing practice of an art whose ultimate result remains on the knees of the gods. It is not an individual temperamental achievement, but simply the skilled use of a captured force, merely another step forward upon the way of universal conquest. Every passage of a ship of yesterday, whose yards were braced round eagerly the very moment the pilot, with his pockets full of letters, had got over the side, was like a race against time, against an ideal standard of achievement outstripping the expectations of common men. Like all true art, the general conduct of a ship, and her handling in particular cases, had a technique which could be discussed with delight and pleasure by men who found in their work not bread alone, but an outlet for the peculiarities of their temperament. To get the best and truest effect from the infinitely varying moods of sky and sea, not pictorially, but in the spirit of their calling, was their vocation, one and all, and they recognized this with as much sincerity, and drew as much inspiration from this reality as any man who ever put brush to canvas. The diversity of temperaments was immense amongst those masters of the fine art. Some of them were like royal academicians of a certain kind. They never startled you by a touch of originality, by a fresh audacity of inspiration. They were safe, very safe. They went about solemnly in the assurance of their consecrated and empty reputation. Names are odious, but I remember one of them who might have been their very president, the PRA of the Seacraft. His weather-beaten and handsome face, his portly presence, his shirt fronts and broad cuffs and gold links, his hair of bluff distinction, impressed the humble beholders, stevedores, tally clerks, tide waiters, as he walked ashore over the gangway of his ship lying at the Circular Quay in Sydney. His voice was deep, hearty, and authoritative, the voice of a very prince amongst sailors. He did everything with an air which put your attention on the alert and raised your expectations, but the result somehow was always on stereotyped lines, unsuggestive, empty of any lesson that one could lay to heart. He kept his ship in apple-pie order, which would have been seamanlike enough but for a finicking touch in its details. His officers affected a superiority over the rest of us, but the boredom of their souls appeared in their manner of dreary submission to the fads of their commander. It was only his apprenticed boys whose irrepressible spirits were not affected by the solemn and respectable mediocrity of that artist. There were 4 of these youngsters, one the son of a doctor, another of a colonel, the third of a jeweler. The name of the 4th was Twentyman, and this is all I remember of his parentage. But not one of them seemed to possess the smallest spark of gratitude in his composition, though their commander was a kind man in his way, and had made a point of introducing them to the best people in the town in order that they should not fall into the bad company of boys belonging to other ships. I regret to say that they made faces at him behind his back, and imitated the dignified carriage of his head without any concealment whatever. This master of the fine art was a personage and nothing more, but, as I have said, there was an infinite diversity of temperament amongst the masters of the fine art I have known. Some were great impressionists. They impressed upon you the fear of God and immensity, or, in other words, the fear of being drowned with every circumstance of terrific grandeur. One may think that the locality of your passing away by means of suffocation in water does not really matter very much. I am not so sure of that. I am perhaps unduly sensitive, but I confess that the idea of being suddenly split into an infuriated ocean in the midst of darkness and uproar affected me with a sensation of shrinking distaste. To be drowned in a pond, though it might be called an ignominious fate by the ignorant, is yet a bright and peaceful ending in comparison with some other endings to one's earthly career which I have mentally quaked at in the interval, or even in the midst of violent exertions. But let that pass. Some of the masters whose influence left a trace upon my character to this very day combined a fierceness of conception with a certitude of execution upon the basis of just appreciation of means and ends, which is the highest quality of the man of action. And an artist is a man of action, whether he creates a personality, invents an expedient, or finds the issue of a complicated situation. There were masters, too, I have known, whose very art consisted in avoiding every conceivable situation. It is needless to say that they never did great things in their craft, but they were not to be despised for that. They were modest, they understood their limitations. Their own masters had not handed the sacred fire into the keeping of their cold and skilful hands. One of those last I remember, especially, now gone to his rest from that sea which his temperament must have made a scene of little more than a peaceful pursuit. Once only did he attempt a stroke of audacity, one early morning with a steady breeze, entering a crowded roadstead, but he was not genuine in this display which might have been art. He was thinking of his own self. He hankered after the meretricious glory of a showy performance. As rounding a dark wooded point, bathed in fresh air and sunshine, we opened to view a crowd of shipping at anchor, lying half a mile ahead of us perhaps. He called me aft from my station on the forecastle head, and, turning over and over his binoculars in his brown hands, said, "Do you see that big, heavy ship with white lower masts? I am going to take up a berth between her and the shore. Now, do you see to it that the men jump smartly at the first order?" I answered, "Aye, sir." and verily believed that this would be a fine performance. We dashed on through the fleet in magnificent style. There must have been many open mouths and following eyes on board those ships, Dutch, English, with a sprinkling of Americans, and a German or two who had all hoisted their flags at 8 o'clock, as if in honor of our arrival. It would have been a fine performance if it had come off, but it did not. Through a touch of self-seeking, that modest artist of solid merit became untrue to his temperament. It was not with him art for art's sake. It was art for his own sake, and a dismal failure was the penalty he paid for that greatest of sins. It might have been even heavier, but as it happened, we did not run our ship ashore, nor did we knock a large hole in the big ship whose lower masts were painted white, but it is a wonder that we did not carry away the cables of both our anchors, for as may be imagined, I did not stand upon the order to let go. That came to me in a quavering, quite unknown voice from his trembling lips. I let them both go with a celerity which to this day astonishes my memory. No average merchantman's anchors have ever been let go with such miraculous smartness, and they both held. I could have kissed their rough, cold iron palms in gratitude if they had not been buried in slimy mud under 10 fathoms of water. Ultimately, they brought us up with the jib boom of a Dutch brig poking through our spanker, nothing worse. And a miss is as good as a mile, but not in art. Afterwards, the master said to me, in a shy mumble, she wouldn't luff up in time somehow. What's the matter with her? And I made no answer. Yet the answer was clear. The ship had found out the momentary weakness of her man. Of all the living creatures upon land and sea, it is ships alone that cannot be taken in by barren pretenses, that will not put up with bad art from their masters. From the main truck of the average tall ship, the horizon describes a circle of many miles, in which you can see another ship right down to her waterline, and these very eyes which follow this writing have counted in their time over 100 sail becalmed, as if within a magic ring, not very far from the Azores, ships more or less tall. There were hardly 2 of them heading exactly the same way, as if each had meditated breaking out of the enchanted circle at a different point of the compass. But the spell of the calm is a strong magic. The following day still saw them scattered within sight of each other and heading different ways. But when at last the breeze came with the darkling ripple that ran very blue on a pale sea, they all went in the same direction together, for this was the homeward-bound fleet from the far-off ends of the earth, and a Falmouth fruit schooner, the smallest of them all, was heading the flight. One could have imagined her very fair, if not divinely tall, leaving a scent of lemons and oranges in her wake. The next day there were very few ships in sight, from our mastheads 7 at most, perhaps with a few more distant specks, hull down beyond the magic ring of the horizon. The spell of the fair wind has a subtle power to scatter a white-winged company of ships looking all the same way, each with its white fillet of tumbling foam under the bow. It is the calm that brings ships mysteriously together. It is your wind that is the great separator. The taller the ship, the farther she can be seen, and her white tallness, breathed upon by the wind, first proclaims her size. the tall mast holding aloft the white canvas spread out like a snare for catching the invisible power of the air, emerged gradually from the water, sail after sail, yard after yard, growing big, till, under the towering structure of her machinery, you perceive the insignificant tiny speck of her hull. The tall masts are the pillars supporting the balanced planes that, motionless and silent, catch from the air the ship's motive power, as it were a gift from heaven vouchsafed to the audacity of man, and it is the ship's tall spars, stripped and shorn of their white glory, that incline themselves before the anger of the clouded heaven. When they yield to a squall in a gaunt and naked submission, their tallness is brought best home even to the mind of a seaman. The man who has looked upon his ship going over too far is made aware of the preposterous tallness of a ship's spars. It seems impossible but that those gilt trucks which one had to tilt one's head back to see, now falling into the lower plane of vision, must perforce hit the very edge of the horizon. Such an experience gives you a better impression of the loftiness of your spars than any amount of running aloft could do. And yet in my time the royal yards of an average profitable ship were a good way up above her decks. No doubt a fair amount of climbing up iron ladders can be achieved by an active man in a ship's engine room, but I remember moments when even to my supple limbs and pride of nimbleness the sailing ship's machinery seemed to reach up to the very stars. For machinery it is, doing its work in perfect silence and with a motionless grace that seems to hide a capricious and not always governable power, taking nothing away from the material stores of the earth. Not for it the unerring precision of steel moved by white steam and living by red fire and fed with black coal. The other seems to draw its strength from the very soul of the world, its formidable ally held to obedience by the frailest bonds, like a fierce ghost captured in a snare of something even finer than spun silk. For what is the array of the strongest ropes, the tallest spars, and the stoutest canvas against the mighty breath of the infinite, but thistle stalks, cobwebs, and gossamer? Indeed, it is less than nothing, and I have seen, when the great soul of the world turned over, with a heavy sigh, a perfectly new, extra stout foresail vanish like a bit of some airy stuff much lighter than gossamer. Then was the time for the tall spars to stand fast in the great uproar. The machinery must do its work, even if the soul of the world has gone mad. The modern steamship advances upon a still and overshadowed sea, with a pulsating tremor of her frame, an occasional clang in her depths, as if she had an iron heart in her iron body, with a thudding rhythm in her progress and the regular beat of her propeller, heard afar in the night with an august and plodding sound as of the march of an inevitable future. But in a gale the silent machinery of a sailing ship would catch not only the power but the wild and exulting voice of the world's soul, whether she ran with her tall spars swinging, or breasted it with her tall spars lying over. There was always that wild song, deep like a chant for a bass to the shrill pipe of the wind, played on the sea tops, with a punctuating crash now and then of a breaking wave. At times the weird effects of that invisible orchestra would get upon a man's nerves till he wished himself deaf, and this recollection of a personal wish, experienced upon several oceans, where the soul of the world has plenty of room to turn over, with a mighty sigh, brings me to the remark that in order to take a proper care of a ship's spars, it is just as well for a seaman to have nothing the matter with his ears. Such is the intimacy with which a seaman had to live with his ship of yesterday, that his senses were like her senses, that the stress upon his body made him judge of the strain upon the ship's masts. I had been some time at sea before I became aware of the fact that hearing plays a perceptible part in gauging the force of the wind. It was at night. The ship was one of those iron wool clippers that the Clyde had floated out in swarms upon the world during the 7th decade of the last century. It was a fine period in shipbuilding, and also, I might say, a period of overmasting. The spars rigged up on the narrow hulls were indeed tall then, and the ship of which I think, with her colored glass skylight, ends bearing the motto, "Let Glasgow flourish," was certainly one of the most heavily sparred specimens. She was built for hard driving, and unquestionably she got all the driving she could stand. Our captain was a man famous for quick passages. He had been used to make in the old Tweed a ship famous the world over for her speed. The Tweed had been a wooden vessel, and he brought the tradition of quick passages with him into the iron clipper. I was the junior in her, a third mate keeping watch with the chief officer, and it was just during one of the night watches in a strong, freshening breeze that I overheard two men in a sheltered nook of the main deck exchanging these informing remarks. Said one, "Should think 'twas time some of them light sails were coming off her," and the other, an older man, uttered grumpily, "No fear, not while the chief mate's on deck. He's that deaf he can't tell how much wind there is." And indeed poor P, quite young and a smart seaman, was very hard of hearing. At the same time he had the name of being the very devil of a fellow for carrying on sail on a ship. He was wonderfully clever at concealing his deafness, and as to carrying on heavily, though he was a fearless man, I don't think he ever meant to take undue risks. I can never forget his naive sort of astonishment when remonstrated with for what appeared a most daredevil performance. The only person, of course, that could remonstrate with telling effect was our captain, himself a man of daredevil tradition, and really for me, who knew under whom I was serving, those were impressive scenes. Captain S. had a great name for sailor-like qualities, the sort of name that compelled my youthful admiration. To this day I preserve his memory, for indeed it was he in a sense who completed my training. It was often a stormy process, but let that pass. I am sure he meant well, and I am certain that never, not even at the time, could I bear him malice for his extraordinary gift of incisive criticism, and to hear him make a fuss about too much sail on the ship seemed one of those incredible experiences that take place only in one's dreams. And it generally happened in this way: night clouds racing overhead, wind howling, royals set, and the ship rushing on in the dark, an immense white sheet of foam level with the lee rail, Mr. P in charge of the deck, hooked on to the windward mizzen rigging in a state of perfect serenity, myself the third mate, also hooked on somewhere to windward of the slanting poop, in a state of the utmost preparedness to jump at the very first hint of some sort of order, but otherwise in a perfectly acquiescent state of mind. Suddenly out of the companion would appear a tall dark figure, bare-headed, with a short white beard of a perpendicular cut, very visible in the dark. Captain S., disturbed in his reading down below by the frightful bounding and lurching of the ship, leaning very much against the precipitous incline of the deck, he would take a turn or two perfectly silent, hang on by the compass for a while, take another couple of turns, and suddenly burst out, "What are you trying to do with the ship?" And Mr. P., who was not good at catching what was shouted in the wind, would say interrogatively, "Yes, sir." Then in the increasing gale of the sea there would be a little private ship's storm going on in which you could detect strong language pronounced in a tone of passion, and exculpatory protestations uttered with every possible inflection of injured innocence. "By heavens, Mr. P., I used to carry on sail in my time, but—" and the rest would be lost to me in a stormy gust of wind. Then, in a lull, P.'s protesting innocence would become audible. "She seems to stand it very well." And then another burst of an indignant voice, "Any fool can carry sail on a ship," and so on and so on, the ship meanwhile rushing on her way with a heavier list, a noisier splutter, a more threatening hiss of the white, almost blinding sheet of foam to leeward. For the best of it was that Captain S. seemed constitutionally incapable of giving his officers a definite order to shorten sail, and so that extraordinarily vague row would go on till at last it dawned upon them both, in some particularly alarming gust, that it was time to do something. There is nothing like the fearful inclination of your tall spars overloaded with canvas to bring a deaf man and an angry one to their senses. So the sail did get shortened more or less in time even in that ship, and her tall spars never went overboard while I served dinner. However, all the time I was with them, Captain S. and Mr. P. did not get on very well together. If P. carried on like the very devil, because he was too deaf to know how much wind there was, Captain S., who, as I have said, seemed constitutionally incapable of ordering one of his officers to shorten sail, resented the necessity forced upon him by Mr. P.'s desperate goings-on. It was in Captain S.'s tradition rather to reprove his officers for not carrying on quite enough, in his phrase, for not taking every ounce of advantage of a fair wind. But there was also a psychological motive that made him extremely difficult to deal with on board that iron clipper. He had just come out of the marvelous Tweed, a ship I've heard heavy to look at, but of phenomenal speed. In the mid-60s, she had beaten by day and a half the steam mailboat from Hong Kong to Singapore. There was something peculiarly lucky, perhaps, in the placing of her masts. Who knows? Officers of men of war used to come on board to take the exact dimensions of her sail plan. Perhaps there had been a touch of genius or the finger of good fortune in the fashioning of her lines at bow and stern. It is impossible to say. She was built in the East Indies somewhere of teak wood throughout except the deck. She had a great sheer, high bows and a clumsy stern. The men who had seen her described her to me as nothing much to look at, but in the great Indian famine of the 70s that ship, already old then, made some wonderful dashes across the Gulf of Bengal with cargoes of rice from Rangoon to Madras. She took the secret of her speed with her, and unsightly as she was, her image surely has its glorious place in the mirror of the old sea. The point, however, is that Captain S., who used to say frequently, "She never made a decent passage after I left her," seemed to think that the secret of her speed lay in her famous commander. No doubt the secret of many a ship's excellence does lie with the man on board, but it was hopeless for Captain S. to try to make his new iron clipper equal the feats which made the old Tweed a name of praise upon the lips of English-speaking seamen. There was something pathetic in it, as in the endeavor of an artist in his old age to equal the masterpieces of his youth, for the Tweed's famous passages were Captain S.'s masterpieces. It was pathetic and perhaps just the least bit dangerous. At any rate, I am glad that, what between Captain S.'s yearning for old triumphs and Mr. P.'s deafness, I have seen some memorable carrying on to make a passage, and I have carried on myself upon the tall spars of that Clyde shipbuilder's masterpiece as I have never carried on in a ship before or since. The second mate falling ill during the passage, I was promoted to officer of the watch, alone in charge of the deck. Thus the immense leverage of the ship's tall masts became a matter very near my own heart. I suppose it was something of a compliment for a young fellow to be trusted, apparently without any supervision, by such a commander as Captain S., though, as far as I can remember, neither the tone nor the manner, nor yet the drift of Captain S.'s remarks addressed to myself did ever, by the most strained interpretation, imply a favorable opinion of my abilities. And he was, I must say, a most uncomfortable commander to get your orders from at night. If I had the watch from 8 till midnight, he would leave the deck about 9 with the words, "Don't take any sail off her." Then, on the point of disappearing down the companionway, he would add curtly, "Don't carry anything away." I am glad to say that I never did. One night, however, I was caught, not quite prepared, by a sudden shift of wind. There was, of course, a good deal of noise running about, the shouts of the sailors, the thrashing of the sails, enough in fact to wake the dead. But S never came on deck. When I was relieved by the chief mate an hour afterwards, he sent for me. I went into his stateroom. He was lying on his couch, wrapped up in a rug, with a pillow under his head. "What was the matter with you up there just now?" he asked. "Wind flew round on the lee quarter, sir," I said. "Couldn't you see the shift coming?" "Yes, sir, I thought it wasn't very far off." "Why didn't you have your courses hauled up at once then?" he asked in a tone that ought to have made my blood run cold. But this was my chance, and I did not let it slip. "Well, sir," I said in an apologetic tone, "she was going 11 knots very nicely, and I thought she would do another half-hour or so." He gazed at me darkly out of his head, lying very still on the white pillow for a time. "Ah, yes, another half-hour. That's the way ships get dismasted." And that was all I got in the way of wigging. I waited a little while and then went out, shutting carefully the door of the stateroom after me. Well, I have loved, lived with, and left the sea without ever seeing a ship's tall fabric of sticks, cobwebs, and gossamer go by the board. Sheer luck, no doubt, but as to poor Mr. P., I am sure that he would not have got off scot-free like this, but for the god of gales, who called him away early from this earth, which is 3 parts ocean, and therefore a fit abode for sailors. A few years afterwards I met in an Indian port a man who had served in the ships of the same company. Names came up in our talk, names of our colleagues in the same employ, and naturally enough I asked after P had got a command yet, and the other man answered carelessly, "No, but he's provided for anyhow. A heavy sea took him off the poop in the run between New Zealand and the Horn." Thus P passed away from amongst the tall spars of ships that he had tried to their utmost in many a spell of boisterous weather. He had shown me what carrying on meant, but he was not a man to learn discretion from. He could not help his deafness. One can only remember his cheery temper, his admiration for the jokes in Punch, his little oddities, like his strange passion for borrowing looking-glasses, for instance. Each of our cabins had its own looking-glass, screwed to the bulkhead, and what he wanted with more of them we never could fathom. He asked for the loan in confidential tones. Why, mystery. We made various surmises no one will ever know now. At any rate, it was a harmless eccentricity, and may the god of gales, who took him away so abruptly between New Zealand and the Horn, let his soul rest in some paradise of true seamen, where no amount of carrying on will ever dismast a ship.